Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. And this time we also have Kerry Jackson, Senior Fellow on California Reform, to talk about the issue that continues to dog California, and that's climate change policy. But before we do that, we want to chat a bit about the looming federal government shutdown. So, well, for my 2 cents, I think it will all eventually work out. Nobody wants a government shutdown, least of all politicians. And I've been through government shutdowns. Very noticeable in DC. Tourists can't visit the museums. They can't go to the monuments, the national parks. The press is all over it. I don't think it's going to happen. It's a lot of drama. What do you guys think?
Well, I have been through them in Sacramento, and it's a pain in the neck, especially if you work for the government. You could potentially be going weeks without being paid. Although, at the time, thankfully, state government workers could get no interest loans from the Golden One Credit Union. So at least there was that. But it's a pain in the neck to go through it. And looking at it from afar, I've been through some of these fights in Sacramento before they changed to majority vote budget. And I feel for my old boss, Speaker McCarthy, because it's a challenge. You've got a small number of stubborn members who are mad at the world and they want to change a lot of things and they think this gives them leverage. Well, it really doesn't. History has shown when you're holding out for what could be extraneous things to the budget or very important things to the budget, you never succeed in the end in getting that deal. The final deals always are very minor changes from what was originally proposed. And, what he's going through now is people are kind of mad and saying no, but they can't say really, what do you want? What's your price? And even when they do, if they get it, those same members will say it's still not good enough. So I feel for him trying to find a reasonable way forward. But, in this environment where there's a 4-seat margin and some of the members are sick, one member really becomes the king of the hill.
I was in D.C. My wife and I were in D.C. mid-'90s. And there were a couple shutdowns under Clinton. And, I think there may be some days where, things aren't happening like they on normal days, as Rose said, that parks are shut down and other places where the public tends to, museums, that sort of thing. But there is a whole lot of sound and fury on these. And eventually, I think, as Rose said, I have to agree, they'll come around on this. It's unfortunate, though, those of us who believe in limiting government seem like we always lose in these cases eventually, though.
That's right. The other thing, too, I remember I was in Washington about a decade ago when Harry Reid shut down the government. And we were going one day, my family and I, we were going to go to Mount Vernon to visit. And one of the great bits of political theater that happens during a government shutdown, they call it the Washington Monument Strategy. So all the parks and all of the federal government-owned monuments close, and they make a big show of having the big close signs. And that's designed for a made-for-TV moment to say, my God, the Washington Monument is closed. What are we going to do? So what was interesting was that I don't know who, some government entity put up barricades in front of the entrance to Mount Vernon. And they came out and had a fit, and they reminded them, this is not federal government property. This is I believe it's the Mount Vernon Ladies Association owns Mount Vernon. And they had to embarrassingly take down the barricades because some overzealous bureaucrat thought, well, here would be a great made-for-TV moment over, surprise, the government does not own Mount Vernon.
I remember that was funny.
That's hilarious, Tim. So anyway, well, let's move on to the reason why we are here, which is to chat with Kerry about climate change policy. So last week was Climate Week in New York City, and Governor Newsom and other liberal lawmakers from California were trying to make a splash on the national stage. The big news on climate change was a lawsuit filed by the governor and Attorney General Bonta against big oil, the impact on climate change. So what exactly are these two suing over, Kerry?
Well, I'm going to go right to the words of the suit themselves. And this is a claim they've made that the defendants, the oil companies, created, contributed to, and or assisted in the creation of a public nuisance and harmed or destroyed natural resources. They also say the oil companies, the industry. Actually, it's not the entire industry, but it's an industry group, and I believe all three companies themselves have misled consumers and the public about climate change for decades. And of course, they blame the oil companies for every weather-related problem that you can possibly imagine: drought, flooding, wildfires, storms, heat, and cold. But these are all natural occurrences we've had. The climate has always produced these phenomena, and there's no reason to believe. And it's funny that they make these claims. When I say they, we see this in the media as well, but politicians too. The experts, who are often themselves believe that the burning of fossil fuels are contributing and are a danger, a threat to the planet with the heating. But look at them and go, no, you can't blame this last hurricane that came up the California coast. You can't blame the wildfires in Maui on climate change. These things happen. There's always these, since going back as far as anybody knows, this is the way the world is. So they're all natural occurrences, and yet they want to sue over this. So we're gonna see where it goes.
You wrote a terrific op-ed that was published last week in the Orange County Register analyzing Newsom's lawsuit. And one of the key points that you made is that Newsom and Bonta and others are now turning to the courts to make inroads on climate policy when it goes too far, even for the California legislature. So what's behind Newsom's thinking here, suing oil companies? Is this a serious effort to try and enact policy change through the courts, or is this just another publicity stunt to gain favors with liberal voters nationally?
I'm going to say it's both. Both elements are involved in that. I don't think they actually believe the suits will be successful. Maybe they do. Maybe they convince themselves that they are. We've seen this kind of thing before. I don't think it's going to get that far. I don't think they're going to be able to put these oil companies out of business, which would be a horrible thing, or fine them excessive amounts of money. Again, we'll see. I predicting these things is even based on precedent really is impossible. You just have to go by what you feel. But even if they're not successful, that amplifies the publicity. They're able to talk about this, and just getting them to court amplifies the publicity, win or lose. So, I want to say that from what I feel, observing 25 years of living in California, that little happens in Sacramento at this point. And it's more so, and I'll use the word, it's worse now than when I first moved here in the first 5 to 10 years of living in California. But nothing gets done in Sacramento, and I'm sure I hope Tim will agree. Maybe he won't. Maybe we'll debate this, but nothing gets done without an eye to public relations and how this is going to play out with their constituency, progressive constituencies, if I want to qualify that a bit.
As a public relations person in Sacramento, I would completely agree, Kerry.
Good. And by the way, I appreciate you calling it a terrific op-ed. I'm grateful for the compliment.
Well, more about your op-ed, Kerry. So PRI's done some research in recent months on the impact of state and local climate change lawsuits. So not surprisingly, the impact of these large judgments is mostly negative. So could you share with us some of PRI's work in this area?
So a senior fellow, Wayne Weingarten, who I've written some papers and homeless book with, and he's terrific to work with. Just a great guy. He's, as we both know, very bright. Sometimes maybe he doesn't get to hear this, but intimidatingly so, with his incisive look at things. It doesn't take him long to take something apart when it needs to be taken apart. But he wrote a policy brief last year, and he showed how litigating climate and energy is simply counterproductive. It imposes heavy costs on consumers, and those hurt worse, those who can least stand to have added costs to their family budgets. And it hurts economic growth. It's going to cause energy prices to rise when you litigate and you take oil companies or energy companies to court, when you push them to do things that are not in their wheelhouse, shall we say, although they do have armies of lawyers to try to protect from this. But it's axiomatic that higher energy prices drag down economies. Economies thrive on cheap energy. And if you're going to increase the cost of energy, you're going to hurt the economy.
So, of course, Newsom and Bonta think that climate change lawsuits and the very invasive government green mandates that have been enacted in California in recent years are essential to fighting an existential threat to the planet. In your writings over the years, you take a different view. So share your thoughts with us. Would there really be any difference at all in making progress on emissions and climate change if Newsom and Bonta got their way?
Since California produces only about 1% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, there's anything in California, anybody in California can do. I asked Richard Lindzen, who is an emeritus professor at MIT. This has been quite a while back on a podcast when I was in Investors Business Daily. What happened if California completely shut down tomorrow everything that burned on fossil fuels? Or you could magically put it that somehow everything that burns on fossil fuels today in California was, pixie dust, for lack of a better example. They were able to run on that. So it's net zero. What difference would that make in the climate? What difference would that make in the global temperature? And he said, not a bit. And then, California will tell you, Californian policymakers, Sacramento will say, well, we're also inspiring the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Well, as we learned in a California conference a few years ago, even if the entire U.S. went net zero, it's not going to have any impact on global temperature or the climate. This is especially true with, again, even though we put out a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions as a country, and that's because we have the biggest economy in the world, it's just not going to change anything. And especially having China and Russia building constantly new coal plants, not only in their own countries, but they're building them elsewhere under contract. I also look at this, and this goes back maybe 30 years of my thinking and reading. The temperature record flawed. It's terrible. There's no way you can compare temperatures they were taking 125 years ago to what we take today. The only real reliable temperature record we have goes back to about 1979, and that would be through satellites. And I say reliable because it's consistent. And it shows a little warming. Nobody should be surprised by that. A little warming over the last 45, 44 years because we are leaving the little ice age. So we are getting a little warmer. And I'm going to take a little extra time here and say, we look at CO2. I mean, that is the bogeyman of the climate alarmists. And it's a weak greenhouse gas, very weak. And there's not a great deal of agreement within climate scientists, researchers, of just how strong it is. I mean, that is the biggest variable. Is it so strong that it can change, that it can hold the heat to the earth, or is it really not so strong after all? And nobody knows. People have their theories, and this stuff about a consensus is pretty silly. Science doesn't work on a consensus. I mean, you come out with what you believe to be the way things are, the truth, but then it's up to other scientists to try to tear it apart to see if it is true. So science is ever evolving. And I will finally finish with this. The models they have been putting out since the late 80s, they're off. They run way too warm. So you can't rely on those either. So that's just what I've been basing I'm going to use the word skepticism on, these things here that I just mentioned.
So, Kerry, another announcement that Newsom made during Climate Week was his intention to sign SB 253, which is a corporate climate disclosure bill, although with some caveats sought by the business community for a cleanup bill that will take place next year. So share with our listeners what this bill would do and why, based on your writings and the work with Wayne Weingarten. And is this another bill that really would just hurt consumers and the economy rather than help the planet?
Again, they are putting a burden on the people, the companies, the industry that actually make our economy, that provide the energy for the economy. Again, I'll go back to what I said, that economies thrive on cheap energy. So they're going to add to this. This is called a Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. And I find it interesting that, right from the beginning, they say in the text, California has demonstrated its leadership in the battle against climate change, and the climate actions of the state have inspired, that word again, and contributed to bold actions in other states across the globe. And to me, this is, and I wrote this, so you guys have seen this, and anybody who's looking at the blog is going to see this too. But it sounds more like a mission statement for the state or a proclamation. This is who we are. This is what we're doing. So, but going back to Wayne's research, it's going to hurt the state business climate, not to be confused with the climate in the sky. Again, because you're adding burdens to a private industry that is indispensable to our economy.
So let's talk about some of the other green mandates coming down from Sacramento. So Governor Newsom and legislative leaders reached a deal at the end of session on a package to build more, quote, clean energy and make the grid more reliable. And one of the key provisions of this is an effort to build the first offshore wind farms off the California coast. Now, you've written that relying on offshore power is a fool's game that policymakers are determined to play anyway. How so?
Well, you said first, and that's the key here. There are no offshore wind turbines off the California coast, and there really aren't a great deal of them around the world. And to site these things off the California coast is going to be terribly expensive. The seafloor drops off very sharp. So if they're going to put wind turbines off the coast, and they want to keep them from being, ruining somebody's view shed off of Santa Barbara or anywhere else on the coast, they're going to have to go out to where it's very deep. They're going to have floating turbines. And, you look at people who are smart about this, and I did some research. I found out that the MIT Technology Review says that floating wind turbines are a speculative and very costly technology, and they complicate, those are my words, what they call a daunting geological challenge. So, yeah, I don't see this happening. I mean, we have about 20 years, or they have about 20 years to reach their 2045 net zero target. And it's going to be hard because they want about a quarter of all renewables, all renewables, but that's essentially what we're going to suppose to have in 2045. They want about a quarter of those to be from wind turbines. And I don't see this happening in a way that they think it's going to be. I think that they're ambitious but I think their ambitions have blinded, not only ambitions to get something done, but they're ambitious to show who they are and what they can do. It just blinded them to the reality. And I should say this, since there's very little of this wind energy in the entire world. I mean, it's almost what you can find. You look at it and go, well, that's kind of an experimental situation. I don't know when they can scale it. Maybe I'll be surprised. I'll wake up one day and they'll have it figured out. But as of right now, it doesn't look like it's going to be scalable. Certainly not the point of can provide a quarter of California's energy in 22 years. And one other thing I should say, that go back to the cost, the expense of the things. We've had developers walk away from wind projects simply because of the cost. They couldn't make them, even with subsidies. They said we can't make enough money for this, so we're not gonna bother. We can't go forward with this.
So another end of session Green Deal involves lawmakers once again using the people's money to promote green vehicles, this time related to hydrogen cars. So we haven't seen much progress in creating this hydrogen highway that was touted by Governor Schwarzenegger a couple of decades ago. So what exactly are policymakers proposing with this latest deal? And in your view, is this latest push likely to meet the same fate as prior efforts to promote more hydrogen-powered cars in the state?
They've essentially gone nowhere. Of 14.3 million cars in the state, there's only about 12,000 powered by hydrogen. You could drive all day and not see one. And so, they're just not out there. But it looks like the state is still going to spend about $300 million building hydrogen fuel stations. I guess I think if you build it, they will come. I'm not so sure that's going to happen. I don't think in our lifetimes we're going to see this as being a viable option. When you talk about that, or I mentioned the 12,000, it actually turns out that hydrogen car sales are actually falling. And I need to mention, and I think Tim will like this because this is one thing that he likes to focus on, is government has a lousy track record picking winners and losers among companies and industries. And there's no reason to think that they're going to pick out a good one here.
Really, the loser here is probably the taxpayer, if you think about it. But...
Well, yeah, it always is. I think maybe if you want to put it that way, it's always the losers are always the taxpayers. I mean, you can have a winner, and they can pick a winner, and they'll do fine because they're subsidized. Unlike, I think we might be getting into some of that later. So I'll leave it for that.
All right. So one issue that you've also written about recently is the fact that not only do electric vehicles cost taxpayers a lot of money with all the subsidies, they also have significant higher repair costs as well. And this is exacerbated by the fact that, on the annual reports, California is rated as having the nation's highest car repair costs. And we know, every day driving them, that our roads are in very bad shape overall. So share what you found about this latest burden on working Californians who government is determined to stick with expensive electric cars.
You can total an EV in what amounts to essentially a fender bender, a very something that you would just drive away from if you had a conventional gasoline-powered or diesel-powered automobile. And that's because if the battery is slightly damaged, in some cases, even that slight damage, it means it's unusable. And because the batteries are so expensive, that is the cost of an EV, is the battery. If you take that out, it's just a shell. It's a golf cart without its own battery. That's what it is. Fewer moving parts than a conventional automobile. So if you can total a car with a fender bender, then the people who are insuring these cars are going to say, yeah, I think this keeps happening when you have these huge payouts. We're going to jack up your premium. And you mentioned roads. I think this is interesting. We had I wrote some years ago about how bad roads were in California, that somebody totaled their normal car, the gasoline-powered car, by hitting a pothole. So, if you can total a gasoline car by hitting a pothole, think about what you could do if your EV hit that pothole too. Again, slight damage to the battery can mean that the car is no longer useful. The battery has to be replaced. At that point, it may exceed the cost of the value of the car. So that's what insurance companies would call a total loss. We have fires, and we've seen this happen. They send, they're harder to put out. Yeah, gasoline, diesel cars catch on fire. They all do. There's a lot of heat under the hood going back through the exhaust system. But the fires we're seeing in EVs, they burn hotter and longer. It takes a great deal more water to put them out, and so that becomes a problem. The insurance companies are looking at this too. I think they're probably weighing how often is compared to conventional automobiles that they're burning. They're catching on fire, and we'll weigh that into their premiums as well. I've even seen, and I if listeners want to check me on this, and hope I didn't dream this up, but I'm sure I have heard, and I should have looked this up before the podcast. Please forgive me, that there was a warning at some point of and I can't remember if it was Tesla or one of the other manufacturers that owner said, for the time being, don't park your EV in the garage, because if it catches on fire, if that battery catches on fire in the middle of the night, your house is going to catch on fire too. So you have a big problem. And if you have a place within a house like the one we live in, where the master bedroom is directly above the garage, you don't have a chance.
Kerry, as we close, let's talk about another green mandate, the federal and state push for more electric buses and vans, including school buses. You recently wrote about the bankruptcy filing of Proterra, a prominent California green car maker that's one of the nation's primary builders of electric buses, vans, and trucks. Is this another Solyndra in the making? And how will Proterra's bankruptcy filing impact the government push for more electric buses?
It certainly has a look and feel of another Solyndra, although it's different in that Proterra has been around for quite some time, I think about 20 years, and they do more than just make electric buses. They make conventional vans and trucks, large vans and trucks, and they're also a parts supplier. It turns out, though, they have a loss on every bus, a financial loss on every bus that they sell. So that's dragging down their business. So they're going to have to deal with that. It's very capital intense to build EVs. It looks like at least Tesla, Elon Musk has kind of figured some things out. If you look at how much it costs per hour in labor to build a Tesla as opposed to a similar General Motors or Ford, it's a better deal. But again, there's a great deal of capital intensity. We've heard stories, other car manufacturers, not just Proterra, but EVs losing money on selling their particular EVs and through their line. So it's, again, hard to predict how this is going to affect government policy. But we've seen, the agenda is the most important thing to so many people who make laws and who regulate, that the reality of situations, no matter how grim they might be or difficult they might be, they're just going to get ignored and have no impact on how they're going forward. They quite often don't seem to learn lessons from things like this, but we'll see if this one will be one where they can say maybe we should back off a little. I will mention this: it looks like that at least with the going back to 2045 target of going net zero with the electrical grid in California, we've seen the extension of several gas plants, electrical plants that are powered by natural gas, and the Diablo Canyon nuclear facility has had its life extended as well, because they really had no choice but to say, we're not going to make it in this transition unless we keep some of the gas and nuclear creating and producing electricity for us, or we're going to have blackout problems. We're not going to be able to keep up with the demand.
Thanks so much, Kerry. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.